Well, I introduced WallBuilders and where we get the name from the book of Nehemiah during the last session. So let me briefly just touch on it. Of course, the children of Israel came back from Babylon and they found Jerusalem was in ruins. And Nehemiah was a wonderful leader, and he led the family, the whole Jewish families together. Each one worked on the wall that was in front of their house. And they had to carry the weapons because they were being attacked while they were building the wall. And they rebuilt the wall in 52 days because they all cooperated and they all followed the lead of Nehemiah. So I like to say that the book of Nehemiah is a story of patriots who loved their country and were willing to defend it against adversaries, rebuilding the foundations and protections of their homeland after they were torn down, neglected, and forgotten. And that is a theme of this particular presentation that I have for you today. Much of what I'm going to share with you has been neglected and forgotten. Neglected and forgotten in the schools, universities, high schools, elementary schools, and even the law schools. I'm going to talk about separation of church and state and what the founders actually meant by that concept of separation in church and state. The concept comes from the First Amendment of the Constitution. The First Amendment cases over the last 50 years have been groundbreaking, and they have departed dramatically from what the founders of this great nation actually intended. Over the last 50 years, you can say that the text of the actual First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution has been cited in about 3,000 cases. But the metaphor, separation of church and state, not the actual text of the First Amendment, has been cited in about 4,000 cases. So courts rely mostly on this separation metaphor. That is what they were taught in their law schools and in their universities, rather than the text of the actual First Amendment itself. I'd like to share with you, this is the religion clauses, this language that I'm about to read to you now, and I'm just going to explain a concept that it's really two parts. This is the first part of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, the first part, and we call this the Establishment Clause. It prohibits Congress from actually establishing a state religion. Or, of course, the Congress part applies to this. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Thereof refers to religion. So we call this the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. So together, of course, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. When I was in law school, I was fascinated by the First Amendment. I obtained both my Juris Doctorate degree and a master's in public policy at the same time. And one of the requirements for obtaining 2 degrees at one time was you had to write a master's thesis that incorporated both your master's degree topic and the law topic. And I chose the First Amendment as the area where I was going to write my master's thesis. And I devoted a whole 2 chapters of my master's thesis to this topic right here. What is the legislative history of the First Amendment? The First Amendment, of course, it was added to the original Constitution by the first Congress. And the first Congress, one of the requirements in Article 1 of the Constitution is that every official proceeding that occurs in Congress, everything that happens, has to be written down. So they have, perhaps you've seen them on TV, court reporters who actually have the little court reporting machine around their neck, and they walk around and they type while they're listening to the congressmen and congresswomen make their speeches. everything that occurs in the House of Representatives during any official session must be written down. So when I wanted to know what did the Congress actually mean when they passed the First Amendment, I read the congressional record. And I read every single word that these 90 men, the first congressmen, wrote about the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, which was, of course, one of the amendments. It actually was the third one in the Bill of Rights. The first two weren't adopted, and they didn't pass. They weren't adopted by the states. So there was actually 12 amendments, but only 10 of them were adopted, and they became the Bill of Rights. And so this was, in the Bill of Rights, it was actually the third one, but it ended up being the First Amendment. So the Congress, the first congressional members, the 90 men that were pictured in that picture, debated the First Amendment from June 7th of 1789 until September 25th of 1789. About 4 months they debated. There's committees that were made their reports on the floor of the Congress, and I read every single word that Congress wrote about the First Amendment. And I'm here to tell you, there is no mention, not once, of the phrase separation of church and state anywhere in the congressional record when they were debating the adoption of the Bill of Rights. Though that phrase, separation of church and state, just was not ever mentioned, not by anybody speaking for or against the First Amendment. So that's, I think, what made a great impression upon me. So it was a challenge then to learn what they meant by the adoption of the First Amendment. What were they thinking when they adopted? Well, a biblical principle is to look at the fruit. Look at the fruit, as Jesus said, of a person's life, and you will see what matters to them. And so let's examine the fruit of the first Congress. The first Congress, actually, one of the first laws that they ever passed was the Northwest Ordinance, incorporating what today we refer to as the Ohio River Valley, beginning in western Pennsylvania and reaching all the way over to Illinois and up into Minnesota and Wisconsin. And Michigan, of course. They wanted to incorporate this as the next section of the United States, and they set out the rules and regulations for the admission of new states into the United States of America. So the Congress adopted the Northwest Ordinance, which, of course, was one of the first laws that George Washington, the first president of the United States, actually signed. And he signed the Northwest Ordinance on August 7th of 1789. And the actual, this is still part of the U.S. Code, and so you can read it, and please check out everything that I'm saying. I want you to check it out. I want you to see and test what I'm saying, if what I'm saying is true. The Northwest Ordinance actually reads, religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall be forever encouraged. And they prescribed for there to be at least one schoolhouse in every regional aspect of, we might call them today counties, of the territory that was going to be incorporated as the future states of the United States of America. And what is so interesting about this is that when they passed that, they actually talked about how important it was to have religion actually taught in the schools of the future United States of America. Here's the Bill of Rights, of course, and you can see here that the First Amendment is down here. It's titled as the third. And the same 90 members of Congress that passed that Northwest Ordinance are the same ones who passed this Bill of Rights. What did Washington do when it came before him? This was actually sent to him right around the October time frame. And at that time, Washington was drawing up one of the first proclamations of Thanksgiving. And that we have copies of the original published versions of Washington's proclamation for a national day of Thanksgiving. He called upon all the citizens of this nation to set aside a day in which they would pray and fast and thank God for all of his blessings and how he had guided the founding fathers through the Revolutionary War and to this era under the new Constitution of the United States. I'm going to read this particular section of the Thanksgiving Day Proclamation because it's very interesting. George Washington said, "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, and to be grateful for his benefits, and to humbly implore his protection and favor." I'm going to point out 4 different words in this proclamation which teach us about what Washington actually believed. Notice he said it is the duty of all nations. Now, duty was more and had a different sense than what we regard today. You know, Washington was a military man. And duty, I think today we think of it as a moral choice. But for Washington, it was an obligation. It was something that was not just a religious preference. It was considered not optional. It was considered mandatory, like a military man or woman, a soldier, has to do their duty. And according to Washington, we had to have a duty to do 4 things. Number 1, to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. That was the duty. To obey his will. And to be grateful for his benefits. And to implore his protection and divine favor. So we had a duty to acknowledge, obey, be grateful, and implore the blessings of God. Now, this next thing I'm going to point out is it a duty of individuals? No, he actually says it is the duty of nations to do this. Nations. Not just individuals, I think, but as a nation, we sought to honor God and to implore his protection, to obey his will, be grateful for all of his many, many blessings. Let me illustrate 2 things about this. Washington did not believe that religion, as it is viewed today in the First Amendment, should be banished from the public square. And he believed that not only that religion belonged in the public square, but that it was a nation's duty to publicly acknowledge God in everything that nation did. The legislative intent of the First Amendment was clear. What was the purpose of the First Amendment? The purpose was for Congress to make no laws that would regard establishment of a national religion and to make no laws that would ever restrict, inhibit, or prohibit the free exercise of religion. How can we establish legislative intent? And I think this is an interesting question, not just because I'm a lawyer and I'm a former judge, but also it's instructive. How do you determine what a legislature actually intended when they pass a law? Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of the United States, spoke upon this, and he wrote very eloquently about it when he said this: "On every question of construction means interpretation of legislative proclamations, we should carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted, and we should recollect the spirit manifested in the debates." He's saying, look to what Congress said they intended by that law. And instead of trying what meaning you can squeeze out of the text of the law, or that you can invent against the text of the law, conform to the most probable one in which that law was passed. James Madison, considered the father of the Constitution and really one of the initial promulgators of the Bill of Rights, actually said this: "I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation, and in that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. And if that not be a guide to expounding it, that is, if the legislative intent is not clear, there can be no security for a consistent and stable, more than a faithful exercise of its powers." If you don't know the intent, and if you don't know what was intended to be protected against with that law, then how can you possibly faithfully carry out the law if you don't know what it was intended to prevent or to promote? The U.S. Supreme Court has actually written very eloquently, and may I add, consistently, for the first 150 years of this nation, and they had a very uniform and consistent approach to the First Amendment. It was the same for 150 years, until about 1947. Let me read from a famous case. And in this particular case, this case was about the First Amendment, but it also expounds upon how you should interpret the First Amendment. The case was the case of the Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States of America in 1892. And they wrote about how to interpret the First Amendment in a case about the First Amendment. The principle of constitutional interpretation was, as the founders wrote, and as the first Supreme Court that took up the issue wrote, determine the evil which was intended to be remedied by that law. What was the law intended to address? What was the evil which was intended to be remedied by the First Amendment? This, I think, is the key to understanding what the founders meant by the First Amendment. And to understand that, I think it's instructive to read what they read. And throughout, from about the 1600s into the 18th century, into the 1700s, one of the most clear and leading publications in this area was written by a pastor named John Wise. John Wise wrote, and I'm going to read this title because it may be difficult to read back there. This is A Vindication of the Government of New England Churches, drawn from antiquity in the light of nature, of holy scriptures, and of noble nature, and the dignity of divine providence has put upon it, by John Wise, written in the Church of Ipswich. And here's the date down here, and it is, that is 72, right? The answer, this article, and this was an actual treatise that he wrote, but he also preached on this topic. What the founders meant to remedy, we have to look at what the church history that they were reading. And they learned from church history, from John Wise, that there were actually 3 periods of church history as they interpreted it. And this is, you may have a different view of church history, but what I'm trying to expound upon is the most popular interpretation of church history that was understood at the time of the founding of this nation. The Reverend Wise taught that the first 3 centuries of Christianity were referred to as the period of purity. By period of purity, what he meant was they had a correct interpretation of church government for about the first 300 years of Christianity. And during this period, During the period of purity, they most faithfully followed the teachings of Christ in this area. And it was the most refined period of time, John Wise wrote. The period is largely what they taught was that the proper role of the church was to determine the theology, that is, the doctrinal beliefs of the church and what the believers should believe. And the proper role of civil government during that period of time was to enforce the laws that were actually published and promulgated by the governing authorities. In other words, the church dealt with theology, and the civil government dealt with enforcement of the laws. He viewed this as the proper roles of government. But things became confused in the 4th century, and for the next 12 centuries in church history, the roles were not only confused between what the government should be doing and what the church should be doing, but the roles were actually reversed. Believe it or not, this period of time is called the Dark Ages, from the 400s up until about the 1500s. And during the Dark Ages, the proper roles were not only confused, but reversed. According to Reverend Wise, this period is called the period of apostasy. And during this period of time, the church openly proclaimed itself to the scandal of the Christian religion, and the state took control of the church. And the state decreed Christianity to be the official religion of the state, and that the church and deprivation of Christianity. At this time, it was wrongly asserted that one of the chief duties for the imperial ruler was to place his sword at the service of the church. So the church actually enforced church attendance and laity and doctrine and everything that the church was going to do. So the government actually enforced church attendance and would enforce who participated in Holy Communion and all of this. This became, of course, the bloodiest time in the period of church history. It was brutal because the civil laws and the sword of government was used to enforce doctrinal purity. And so this was a period of the Dark Ages and the second period of church history. Give me a second. During this period is best illustrated by a merger. The states determined the theology during this period of time, and the church was the enforcer of the civil laws. The roles were reversed from the first period of church history. This was referred to, of course, as the period of apostasy. And during this period of time, of course, the scriptures were taken away from the actual believers. Literacy was not promoted. And, when it was promoted during the Reformation, one of the purposes of promoting literacy was so that each individual believer could read the scriptures for themselves. And this was considered to be a radical notion. And actually, it was made illegal in many of these jurisdictions. Some of the leaders of the Protestant Reformation, of course, William Tyndale, Martin Luther, John Wycliffe, Thomas Cranmer, these men were persecuted for teaching that each believer should have his own copy of the Scriptures and should be able to read and understand the Holy Scriptures for and of themselves, and that each individual believer was to have a direct relationship with God and didn't have to go through church church leaders in order to commune with God. And each individual believer did not have to rely upon the church government and the church leaders to read them the scriptures. This, of course, was referred to as the period of Reformation. And during this period of time, many kings resisted the Reformation movement, and they persecuted these people. And in England, of course, it went so far as to say that you had to confess that King Henry VIII was the head of the church and the head of government. And what was perhaps, I think, the clearest illustration of what the founders wanted to try to avoid is a complete merger of church government with civil government. And during this period of time, you could not, and believers were required to actually declare that they accepted and that they believed that the head of the church and the head of the government were one. And the ones who would not admit to that, they were called the Dissenters. Some of the famous dissenters during that period were Erasmus and Zwingli and John Knox and John Calvin. Some of these were actually martyred for that belief themselves. And of course, Henry VIII was responsible for the martyrdom of some of these saints. Under King Henry VIII, there was a total merger of church and state. Kings began to be threatened. Consequently, as ruthless leaders of church and state, they initiated bloody purges, utilizing the most cruel tortures. I'm reading from the publication of John Wise here. The cruel tortures and the barbaric persecutions to suppress the followers of the renewed biblical teaching. This led to mass migrations to America. Many Huguenots estimated that 400,000 Huguenots fled France during this period. In England, leaders such as King Henry VIII attempted to suppress the Reformation and individual teachings by publicly burning dissenters at the stake. Edward VI, Mary, and Queen Elizabeth I, and subsequent monarchs continued those efforts to punish and persecute and sacrifice the lives of these dissenters. In fact, King James I even concocted 2 revolutionary new government church doctrines to help him suppress the growing influence of the Protestant Reformation in England. He instituted the belief in the divine right of kings to be adopted in England as the official church and government doctrine, and the complete submission and non-resistance to authority. In other words, you would be put to death if you did not confess complete submission to the British monarchy. So these dissenters, of course, were among the first colonists in New England. The Pilgrims, the Puritans, of course, were the first ones, and the Pilgrims came later. Excuse me, I reversed that. The Pilgrims were the first ones, and then the Puritans came within the first 60 to 70 years. One of the groups that was persecuted during this period of time, the Pilgrims, were the founders of the Plymouth Bay, Massachusetts colony, and they called themselves Dissenters. And it was from this area of the country that John Wise began to preach his sermons and publish them during this period of time. This view of church history was the answer to the question of what was the evil that was intended to be remedied by the First Amendment. It was an establishment of religion like England had. That is, where the civil government would be unified with the church government. And an establishment, and this is the easiest and most concise way to frame the view of the founders, is they sought to avoid the establishment of one denomination by the Congress. It said, Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion. They didn't want to, there were many many denominations in the United States, and they didn't want one denomination to be superior to the other with respect to Congress. So Congress could not make any law officially adopting one. You know, many of the colonies, and surprisingly, some of the states, even after we were the United States of America, there was still an official religion. I'm from Virginia, and the official religion was the Anglican, which is the Episcopal Church. And tax dollars were used to fund the theology and the divinity schools of an official state church. And state funds were used to support church teachings, even in Virginia and in 2 or 3 other of the states and the colonies during that time. During the 1850s, there was a movement in America called the National Liberal League. And the National Liberal League wanted to promote this absolute separation of any sort of religious exercise in the federal government. And they were gaining in popularity in some circles, and so it came before Congress. And in the United States Senate and in the House, they actually conducted hearings about what was the intent of the First Amendment. And I'm going to read you what the U.S. Senate and the Congress actually concluded. This was a flyer from the National Liberal League. And let me read a section here. The National Liberal League promoted the total separation of church and state to be guaranteed by amendment of the United States Constitution, including the equitable taxation of church property, secularization of public schools, abrogation of Sabbatarian law, abolition of chaplaincies. They wanted to abolish all government chaplains, prohibitions of any public appropriations for religious purposes, and all other measures necessary to the same general end. So it gained enough ground so that they had to have congressmen actually conduct hearings and report on what the National Liberal League was preaching. Was this true? Is that what was intended by the First Amendment? I'm going to read you the conclusion of the U.S. Senate report in 1853. They said, the founders intended to prohibit an establishment of religion such as the English church presented, or anything like it, but they had no fear or jealousy of religion itself, nor did they wish to see us an irreligious people. They did not intend to spread over all of the public authorities and the whole public action of the nation the dead and revolting spectacle of any atheistical apathy. They did not intend to promote atheism, in other words. Listen to what the House concluded. They concluded their report the very next year in 1854. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one denomination. Any attempt to discard religion would have been viewed with universal indignation. Religion must be considered as the foundation on which the whole structure rests. Similar to, as I shared in the last presentation that I shared with you, the founders believed that religion and morality were indispensable, as George Washington put it, supports for the national government and our form of constitutional government. But yet, today, this is totally dismissed. And it's, as you will see, flipped on its head, turned upside down to mean almost the exact opposite of what the founding fathers intended. You know, Thomas Jefferson is actually viewed by courts today as the authority on the First Amendment. And much of what I'm going to share is considered to be heresy when discussing Thomas Jefferson. But that is because he is used to prop up this notion of the false interpretation and the false mythologies that surround the First Amendment. If you're interested more in dismissing some of the lies that are told about Thomas Jefferson, you'll be interested in this publication. It's by David Barton, and it's called The Jefferson Lies, Exposing the Myths You've Always Believed About Thomas Jefferson, by David Barton, forward by Glenn Beck. Much of what I'm going to share is covered in this book. For modern courts, Thomas Jefferson is the authority on the Constitution and the First Amendment. What was Thomas Jefferson's role in framing the Constitution and the First Amendment? If he's considered to be the authority, what did he think about it? Well, he had a friend that was writing a textbook at this time, and before he published the textbook, he sent it to Thomas Jefferson to read. And Thomas Jefferson said, "Oh, that's good job there, Dr. Priestley, but I have to correct one of the things you said." He said, "I was actually in Europe. I was serving as an ambassador when the Constitutional Convention was planned, and I never actually saw it until long after it was published." He is not in the picture of the signers of the Constitution, as he was prominently featured in the famous portrait of the signature of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, of course, is the tallest central figure in the Declaration of Independence as the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. But let me flip back to the Constitution. He is not in the picture of the signers of the Constitution. In fact, most people today, if we ask them to identify one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, most people can spot Thomas Jefferson as one of the most popular or prominent founding fathers at that time. But yet, he wasn't here, and he didn't claim to be an authority on the Constitution or on the First Amendment. But it's interesting and it's instructive to learn what were Jefferson's actual church practices. This is covered in the book on the Jefferson Lies. You know, we touched on this earlier in the earlier presentation that when Washington was planned out, by the way, it was the architects that planned it were actually hired by Thomas Jefferson. And so he had a role in planning out the planning of Washington and the layout of the streets and the Capitol and the White House. And this is the Capitol and the way it looked in 1800. And this is a similar topic that I covered earlier because it answers the question, what were Thomas Jefferson's actual church practices? And of course, we saw that the record in Congress is required to keep records by the Constitution. And so we have the detailed decision of what happened on Thursday, December 4th, when the Speaker of the House approached the President of the Senate, Thomas Jefferson, and informed the House that the chaplains had proposed to have divine services in the Capitol. And the dates are very important here, and I'll touch on this in a bit. But Thomas Jefferson, actually on January the 1st, 1802, this is the day that he actually wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. This famous letter, and the section that I have highlighted, I have to tell you, this is housed in the archives of the University of Virginia. And when I was attending there in the 1980s, we were actually allowed, as students of the University of Virginia, to go in and examine this letter. We had to wear gloves, and it was behind a locked door. But, you just had to say that I need to do it for one of my classes. And you would be observed the whole time by one of the curators, and you had to wear these white gloves. And we actually got to examine this letter. Famous letter in which Thomas Jefferson said, now the Danbury Baptists, they loved Jefferson because he had published the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom and advocating that Virginia no longer support the Anglican Church. And the Danbury Baptist associations and the Baptists loved Thomas Jefferson for promulgating the concept of freedom of religion. And yet, when he was president, of course, was one of the first years of the adoption of the Bill of Rights. And so they were concerned because how could the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom that said government had no right to dictate what a person believed or practiced in their own faith, how could the author of that religious freedom statute be in support of the First Amendment that actually gave Congress jurisdiction, if you will, the right to pass laws on the practice of religion? And Thomas Jefferson actually wrote, and if you read this letter, and I encourage you, please, read the whole letter, because the purpose of the letter is to reassure the Baptists that, wait a minute, don't worry about the government ever passing a law that is going to restrict your free exercise of your religion. Because, he said, there is a wall of eternal separation between church and state that is erected by the First Amendment. And what he was referring to is that there is a prohibition of Congress ever making a law that would ever restrict your free exercise of religion. In other words, the wall was a wall of protection for the free exercise of religion. And I'm confident that if you read the entire letter, you will see that he was referring to the free exercise clause, not to the establishment clause. And yet, courts later have taken that phrase out of context and flipped it over. This is 180 degrees to mean the exact opposite of what it was intended to mean. They have reinterpreted this phrase in this letter so that now courts just cite this letter and don't cite the actual law. And they use this letter, and when it was referred to in the 1800s, they published the entire letter in the court opinion that I read you, the Church of the Holy Trinity, 1892. You can read the entire letter. It's quoted in that court opinion. But yet, when it was quoted in 1947, in a case called Everson versus the United States, you'll see that they quote just this clause, just this sentence, erect an eternal wall of separation between church and state. In other words, they were afraid that the public would actually read the entire letter and be knowledgeable of the fact that they were trying to deceive the public about what Jefferson meant by this phrase on the wall of separation in church and state. The date is important. You'll see this. January 1st, 1802 is the date on this letter. January the 1st, 1802 was a Friday. All right? January 3rd, of course, was a Sunday. And because we have the Danbury Baptist letter that's dated, and we have the congressional record that is dated, and because we have the sermons that were preached in the U.S. Capitol, which are also dated, we know exactly what Jefferson was doing on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in 1802. And this was one of the beginning of his administration. The preacher that preached the sermon on January the 3rd of 1802 was the Reverend John Leland. We know that because he published his sermon. It says published and preached in the hall of the House of Representatives on January 3rd, 1802. So he writes the letter to the Danbury Baptists on January 1st, in which he says there's an eternal wall of separation between church and state. But yet he goes over and attends religious services in the hall of the House of Representatives in the capital of the United States of America on Sunday. And the reason that we know this is because of one of Jefferson's political enemies. Jefferson was an Anti-Federalist, and Manasseh Cutler, who he's dressed like a reverend, he actually was a reverend. Manasseh Cutler was a Federalist, and he hated Thomas Jefferson and his whole party. And he often published things that would be critical, and he was trying to speak of the hypocrisy of Jefferson when he published this. He said, it was a very rainy day, and he said, and Jefferson, ardent zeal, apparently, he was using this sarcastically, saying that he must be a hypocrite because he doesn't really believe this. He showed his ardent zeal brought him through the rain on horseback to the hall of the House of Representatives. In other words, Jefferson didn't ride a carriage from the White House over to the Congress. He rode his own horse, and it was quite a ways. And considered, for leaders, it was stylish to ride in a carriage, not to ride on horseback. Poor people rode on horseback, in other words. Jefferson and his family have constantly attended, Manasseh Cutler wrote in his diary, attended public worship in the hall of the House of Representatives. So we know, why did he attend church at the Capitol? Well, he actually wrote on this. Somebody asked him about what Manasseh Cutler was publishing. He said, look, no nation has ever existed or has been governed without religion, nor can it be governed without religion. The Christian religion is the best religion that has been given to man, and I, as the chief magistrate of this nation, am bound to give it the sanction of my example. Speaking directly of why he attended church service every single Sunday in the hall of the House of Representatives. Not only did he attend it, but he thought that the music was slightly inadequate, so he ordered the Marine Corps band to lead the praise and worship and play the music at the church services in the Capitol, in the hall of the House of Representatives. And the Marine Corps band was used and led the worship service in the U.S. Capitol. Now, was anyone ever taught this in school? Okay. So, as I shared during the last presentation, this tradition, which started the second week that the Capitol was opened, okay, way back in 1800, continued for almost 70 years until 1867. And by the time that it ceased in 1867, 2,000 people a week were meeting in the House, and 4 different churches were meeting in the different halls of the U.S. Capitol. And as I've shared with you at WallBuilders, we have copies of the sermons that were actually preached in the hall of the House of Representatives. This one, 1822. This one was Substance of Discourse, preached in the hall of the House of Representatives on Sunday, January the 8th, 1826. Sermon from the Capitol on the imperishable and saving words of Christ, delivered in the hall of the House of Representatives, 1860. Sermon on the public worship of God, which was delivered in the hall of the House of Representatives, Sunday, January 31st, 1864. So when and why did Jefferson actually use the separation metaphor, if he actually believed in separation of church and state the way courts quote him now? Well, 1801, this is the letter from the Danbury Baptist. The letter from the Danbury Baptist to Thomas Jefferson was October 1801, and his answer, of course, was January 1st. And this entire letter, I misspoke earlier when I said that the whole letter was first published in U.S. versus Holy Trinity in 1892. This is the actual case where the whole letter was first published. It's Reynolds versus the United States of America in 1878. And they quoted it correctly. And as I said, it's evident from the context of the letter that Jefferson is referring to the wall of separation as protecting the free exercise clause. And this was the prevailing view for over 150 years until this court case, 1947, Everson versus the Board of Education. It was written by a Supreme Court justice named Hugo Black. Hugo Black was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. He was Franklin Roosevelt's political lawyer. He represented his campaign. He was a member of Congress at that time. He was a very controversial appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court because Hugo Black was the lawyer for the Ku Klux Klan. Let me say that again. The justice nominated by Franklin Roosevelt was Hugo Black, who was the lawyer and a member of the Ku Klux Klan. That is the person who wrote and misquoted and quoted out of context the letter that Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist, in which it took the opposite meaning and applied the wall of separation to the Establishment Clause and not to the Free Exercise Clause. And he didn't publish the whole letter, he just published that one sentence. So he knew what he was doing. That precedent, Everson versus Board of Education, where it said the wall of separation must not be crossed by the government or by religion, was adopted by Earl Warren, famous governor of California. Earl Warren was governor 4 terms in California. Did you know that? He was the only governor that was never opposed in his first 2 campaign re-elections. In other words, and I know this is hard to believe, 1947, look it up, he was nominated by both the Republican and the Democratic Party to be governor. Isn't that hard to believe? 4 terms. He was educated right down the street at Stanford University, Stanford Law School. 15 years after Hugo Black wrote about the wall of separation, Earl Warren wrote the opinion that, and this embodied his philosophy, the Constitution, and you know, I'm not sure I blame Earl Warren. This is how he was taught it. The Constitution must draw its meaning from evolving standards that mark the progress of a maturing society. He viewed the Constitution as a living and breathing document that must evolve as society evolves. And that is one of the prevailing ways that is taught in many law schools. That is not the biblical view of law. Law, according to the Bible, is fixed, uniform, and universal. It does not change with evolving standards of society. So this view that Earl Warren employed was used in 2 decisions, Engel versus Vitale, 1962, and Abingdon versus Schempp. Engel versus Vitale, 1962, was the U.S. Supreme Court case that outlawed voluntary prayer in public schools. It was declared unconstitutional as violating the wall of separation between church and state, which had been misquoted, misinterpreted, and turned on its head by Hugo Black in 1947, 15 years earlier. Did they know what they were doing? I think they did. You know, if you're researching a Supreme Court opinion and you want to know, has this letter from Jefferson ever been quoted before? Then they would certainly know, and the law clerks would show the judge U.S. versus Reynolds from 1878, Church of Holy Trinity from 1892, and every other opinion that had ever been written on the First Amendment for the first 150 years, because they turned it on its head, because the law had evolving standards. Abingdon versus Schempp, published the very next year by the Supreme Court, outlawed the voluntary reading of Scripture in public schools and declared it unconstitutional as a violation of the wall of separation between church and state. These 2 bad decisions have led to a litany of other court cases which absolutely perverted and changed forever. I shouldn't say forever, changed dramatically. There has been some hope in recent years that the Supreme Court is going to return to a more traditional view of the First Amendment. But these decisions, Engel versus Vitale and Abingdon Schempp, have been later used by the U.S. Supreme Court to outlaw elective classes in the Bible, which were halted in public schools. The Bible has been ordered out of school libraries. The publication of the 10 Commandments displayed in schools has been banned. Religious artwork must be covered up in public schools. The religious content of student-initiated newspapers exercising their First Amendment free speech has been forbidden and even penalized. Prayer and invocations, voluntary prayers by students in public schools, are now excluded from graduation ceremonies and athletic events. Traditional Christmas displays, the principle of the separation of church and state that was articulated in these two cases has been used to ban Christmas displays in public and in governmental institutions. And even giving Christmas cards in public schools has been declared illegal and in violation of the separation of church and state. Congress has forgotten to consult the language. Courts have abandoned the principle of following the text of the Constitution, and they now rely on the interpretation from the last judge that wrote the opinion, which is the prevailing attitude among judges now. Such that the modern interpretation, and this is kind of a restatement of the current view of the First Amendment, is that there is a wall of separation between the Christian faith and the public square, such that any expression of faith must stay inside the four walls of the church. Sure, courts and modern courts say you can practice your faith, but do it inside the four walls of the church and don't do it outside of that. It's the opposite of what Jefferson wrote in the letter to the Danbury Baptists, and it's the opposite of what the Founding Fathers intended. This view, which I would like to label as compartmentalization, that is, practice your faith, but only practice it in private, never in public. This is the prevailing view of, unfortunately, not only the courts and legislatures, but also of many Christians, even today, that willingly accept the opposite of what the Founding Fathers meant to enshrine in our Bill of Rights. This is what it actually says. Congress, notice it doesn't apply to states, doesn't apply to municipalities, doesn't apply to any other governmental institution except for Congress, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. They have not only forgotten the text of the First Amendment, but they've forgotten what Thomas Jefferson actually wrote. On every question of construction of the law, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted, and recollect the spirit manifested in the debates. And instead of trying what meaning can be squeezed out of the text or invented against the text, conform to the most probable one in which it was passed. And so I can tell you now that, unfortunately, like the walls of Jerusalem were forgotten and abandoned when the children of Israel were in Babylon, the foundations of our religious liberties have been forgotten and abandoned by many courts and many legislatures in today's modern society. And unfortunately, this attitude has even crept into the church. You know, when I was in law school, Ronald Reagan gave his farewell address. And believe it or not, in my law school, we actually got popcorn and watched Reagan's farewell address. Ronald Reagan said on January 11th, 1989, I graduated from law school the very next year. He said this: "If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are." I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit. And I'm here to tell you that we have forgotten what the true interpretation of the First Amendment actually was. And for too many judges and lawyers and even some patriots, this history has been totally forgotten, neglected. Like in the book of Nehemiah, the foundations of Jerusalem. But I'm here to tell you that people who love their country, patriots together, united, and they started to rebuild the foundations and the protections of their homeland after they were torn down and neglected and forgotten for an entire generation. And that's why WallBuilders is here. We want to help, lead the way, provide you resources to present America's forgotten history and forgotten heroes, emphasizing our moral, religious, and our constitutional heritage. If this interests you, I encourage you to get one of the newest publications, The American Story, published by WallBuilders. David and Tim Barton have published this just this year. It's fantastic. It tells the story of American history without leaving God out of it, beginning with Christopher Columbus and ending with the Civil War. Volume 2 for the period of time after the Civil War is coming up soon. The American Story. The Founders' Bible, if you want to know what the founders actually believed about biblical principles and how they apply to every single area of life, and not just to spiritual and religious endeavors, but how the Bible talks about taxes and economics and law enforcement and judges and lawyers, what they should do, how to treat the poor, how to exercise charity in a way that God intended. We have many publications at WallBuilders, including Original Intent, 4 Centuries of American Education, The Lives of the Founders, Spiritual Heritage Tour, The Capitol, The Jefferson Lies, The Roles of Christians and Pastors in American Society. And to help you, we've given each of you, and if you don't have one, we'll make it available to you, a coupon for 20% off. Use this code for Diaz20 and buy it. These resources on WallBuilders are incredible. Any question you can think of, you can find the answer on this website. It is amazing. WallBuilders spends a tremendous amount of resources trying to put what is essentially the largest collection of early American documents held in private hands in the United States of America available to everyone, so that you can see the words of the founders in their own words, what they actually wrote, what they actually believed. Don't take my word for it. Don't take the word of a college professor just because he or she has PhD after their name. Okay? Don't take the word of a lawyer, even though we have JD after our name. Okay? Check it out yourselves. See what Jefferson actually wrote. See what James Madison actually wrote about the Constitution and about the First Amendment. You know, James Madison was the source of many of the notes that were used to record the activities of that first Congress that wrote that first Bill of Rights. He participated and wrote much of that content that was included in the transcripts of the Congress. And so you've been a tremendous audience. I can tell that you're very interested in this topic, and I would encourage you to visit wallbuilders.com. Thank you very much.